Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As you can see up here, I have the upcoming calls. We have Ben Schneiderman, who's actually on the call today, along with today's call that we have Bruce Parks to thank for nominating him for a call. Kevin Clark will be managing the question and answer period. If you have questions, just post it in the chat or raise your hand in the participants tab. Regarding the participants tab, it would be helpful if you rename yourself. If you only have your first name, like I'll ping you individually. If you need help with that, just private message me. With that, I'd like to have Bruce Park introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's a wonderful to have Chris Tassone here. For all of you who haven't read his bio, he's a professor of chemistry at Stanford. And to just give you a short history of the origin of the call, last fall I was on a call with May Lynn, and I mentioned that my wife Judy, who's a culinary professor at a local community college, and the degree of difficulty she was experiencing in trying to teach a hands-on class online. Really, it was an impossible situation. However, it certainly was reflective of the difficulty, excuse me, of the difficulty that people are experiencing all across the country, and pointed very clearly at the underlying problems of education in this country. But consequent to that conversation, I began looking for technological solutions, and through a mutual friend, I met Chris Tassone. Chris, as I mentioned, is a chemistry professor at Stanford, and he's developed this wonderful VR chemistry course so that his students can actually learn chemistry by using these goggles like the ones I have here in my hand, as well as these laser movers. And he graciously sent me this headset, and from it you can quickly learn how you combine atoms to create molecules, how to balance chemical equations, etc. And I don't believe that any particular technology is going to fix our broken educational system, but I do believe that what Chris is creating will be a very, very valuable tool in opening doors and minds as we attempt to solve the educational puzzle. So with that, Chris, welcome to the PCI community. We certainly appreciate your being here, and please talk to us and let people know what it is that you're doing, because I personally and obviously find it very exciting. So thanks again, Chris.
No problem. Yeah, thank you all. I'm thrilled to be here. Let me get the screen share up. Thrilled to be here and get the chance to talk to you all about what we've been doing at SAMA. So a little bit about my background, just to put some context into this. So I'm actually the division director for the material science division at SLAC National Lab, just up the hill from Stanford. And oh, sorry, wrong thing there. I was trying to figure out how to get the galley back up too. And I run a group who's focused on what we call data-driven discovery. So what that means is we look at ways to measure kind of the structure and the response to a perturbation of that structure. And then we train artificial intelligences to predict what types of materials we should make for instance, the best solar cells that one might want to have in their backyard. And the reason that I bring that up is because what I'm going to be talking today a little bit about is the power of VR, not only to scale really strong education interventions, but also the ability for VR to give us more data than we ever dreamed about in terms of what the students are doing. So let me get into that. So what I founded SAMA around was a mission to help improve STEM retention and foster a love of STEM learning. Obviously, I am a scientist. Part of the reasons for this motivation was just seeing how many of my students I felt were unsuccessful. I actually had the idea for SAMA when I was driving down to go teach a class on light matter interaction. And I happened to be listening to a podcast about what was happening at CES, and people were talking about virtual reality. And it was just one of those aha moments where I realized I was about to go draw equations on a whiteboard for 50 minutes to a group of 50 students of complex mathematics. And if I could just put the students in a physical representation of those complex mathematics, then not only would they understand where the different terms are coming from, but it would make things real for them in a way. And that really wasn't going to happen in the course I was just about to go teach. And so that's what sparked the idea behind Sama. And what is so exciting to me about VR is it gives us a pathway to scale things that we know work. So there are, 6 decades of research into education theory, how to teach people, how people learn. It's only getting more advanced with coupling neuroscience into that. The issue is, even when we know things work, they're not scaled into every classroom right away. The other thing, as I mentioned briefly, that's so exciting about VR is it gives us a pathway to data-driven improvements to education. So what I like to say when we're watching a student in VR with our system, it's basically the equivalent of if a student or a teacher had sensors on all of their students while they're teaching them and could understand when they are getting the point that you're trying to make, where they're failing, what their remediation pathway needs to be. We're getting access to that data in real time because we're seeing every way the students interacting with the education environment around them. And then ultimately, what this enables us to do is increase access to high quality education, because once we've developed a course in VR and proven its efficacy, now that can be scaled as easily as sending a headset, and the cost point of headsets are just going down and down over time. When I originally founded Sama, there was a large push nationally to increase STEM retention. So there was a study in 2010 out of the Obama White House that looked at the projected shortfall of STEM graduates in the United States by 2020. We were on track to be 1 million STEM graduates short of what is needed for the job market. And so there was a lot of work that went into looking, how can we address this in the time scale that's needed, right? What are the changes that need to be made in a 10-year period? And the focus quickly turned to retention. So less than 40% of students who enter college intending to major in a STEM field nationally complete their degree within 6 years. And if we can move that number from 40% to 50%, you can meet 75% of this projected shortfall. And down here is just kind of a visual example of that pipeline. Of 100 incoming college students or university students, only 28 express STEM interests. 14 of them will declare, and ultimately 6 will graduate. And so we're talking about increasing this percentage by a very small amount. And I would say, kind of secondly, and of course I'm showing my bias here, but STEM thinking is critical thinking. And so if we can increase STEM literacy, even for students who would never pursue a STEM career, we're ultimately improving their ability to think critically and use rational thinking to address problems that they'll encounter regardless of the field that they work in. So because of this study, or this report out of the Obama White House initially, there's actually been a ton of work to understand what are the qualities of people who leave STEM fields. And so the first one, I would say, are demographic factors. So underrepresented populations have half the retention rate of the majority populations. One of the other piece in terms of readiness is math readiness was critical to success. There are attitudinal factors in terms of motivation, confidence, people's ability to self-identify that they are capable of learning this is an enormous hurdle. And then there are course-related factors. So negative experiences in those first-year gatekeeping courses had a hugely disproportionate effect on whether students persisted in their STEM field or not. So for example, students who had a 1-letter grade difference were 50% more likely to leave. If you went from a C average in your first year STEM courses to a B average, you were 50% more likely to stay. Students who took less than 50% of their first year credits from STEM courses were more likely to leave. And then poorer performance in these classes, particularly relative to the other courses you're taking. So this begs the question, how do we turn these people who are leaving at disproportionate rates into persisters or into stayers? And again, we can look at decades of education research to understand what works and what doesn't. Generally, diversifying teaching methods. So as instructors, we tend to teach the way we successfully learned, but that's not going to be the pathway for everyone. And so we need to find opportunities to give diverse pathways to acquiring knowledge. Secondly, the use of evidence-based teaching methods. I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer, but if you're measuring what's effective and what's not, you obviously have a better defined guideposts to producing effective education outcomes. Improving mathematical competency is just across the board necessary. And so any remediation strategy that is going to improve retention rates needs to have mathematical competency remediation as part of that strategy. And focusing on the first 2 years of those general education courses is critical, because that's when people are making this decision of whether to persist or not. And, you know, largely, this is a problem I think we can see coming. I always love this picture of a classroom in 1920 in the United States. And this is a classroom at Stanford in 2015. And so although, you know, there are all of these new tools that can be accessed, generally the bread and butter of teaching and education, especially in the university system, is still lecture-based education. So talking at people. And this is problematic because, oh, I accidentally deleted a slide that should be in here. That's okay, I can speak to it. This is problematic because we know things that work, and if we're not changing the classroom around them, we're not going to see the results of these effective interventions into education. So one thing that we know works reasonably well is when we use digital tools to simulate complex environments. Across the board, this increases learning outcomes. It promotes positive emotional experiences, probably related to the increased flow that students experience when they're using digital tools. And so for those who aren't familiar, flow is the ideal state between anxiety, where you're overstressed, and boredom, where you're understimulated. And information retention is significantly increased and learning goes up when you're in a flow state. So we know digital tools can help with this, provided that they're well designed. The slide that I deleted talks about active learning. So active learning is the flip side of a lecture-based experience. So active learning can be something as simple as using multiple choice questions and a clicker followed by discussion sessions around a question that's presented in the middle of a lecture. It can also be complex problem-based inquiry, where you're giving students a sandbox or an activity to explore potential outcomes around a problem and guide their own learning. And so there's a huge range of active learning education interventions specific to every field. And every different type of learning objective someone might have. And generally, we know these work. So for things like clicker questions, just integrating clicker questions has shown to be relatively agnostic to the institution or the instructor that's using them, and on average produces an improvement in the student learning outcome of about half a letter grade. So that begs the question, why aren't we using these things that we know work in every classroom in America and globally? The first piece I think is hard to understate. People talk about how entrenched healthcare is. If there is a system that is more entrenched than healthcare, it is the education system. So the number of times I've spoken to colleagues of mine to talk about any education intervention, and I get the response that I've taught at a chalkboard with chalk in my hand for 30 years, and I'm going to do that until I retire. That's a problem. And the way that you convince these folks, because at the end of the day, they are data-driven people, is you need a preponderance of evidence that this tool is significantly more effective, whatever this tool is, than what they're doing now. Kind of part and parcel with that is the development of a curriculum or the pedagogy is distributed. Every instructor is the king or queen of their own castle, largely. And while there are standards and specific topics that need to be covered to speak to national accreditation requirements, largely the instruction is driven completely by the instructor. And so it's not the case that you need to influence or convince one central organization. You have to do hand-to-hand combat with every instructor for the, let's say, 20 million students who are university students in the US right now. Largely, the biggest hurdle is scaling interventions are resource intensive. So let's take clicker questions as an example. We know they're effective. It's not very expensive to integrate, so it's not a cost issue. The issue is purely for an instructor to rewrite their course to include clicker questions is a huge investment of time. And you have to do this for every instructor who wants to rework their course. Occasionally you get departments working together to rework a set of courses to do this. But again, this is still very resource intensive, and it's a one-to-one kind of intervention and change strategy. Of particular importance as well is the lack of comprehensive applicability. And so if you have niche interventions that improve a specific component of a curriculum, you're not going to motivate people due to the resource intensiveness to actually go through the effort of integrating this into their course. And lastly, I think harkening back to this classroom photo that I showed, we really haven't done a good job keeping up our classroom infrastructure with the technological advances that have occurred over the last decade or two for students to take advantage of, I would say, with the exception of the smartphone. And that leads me to why VR is going to be so important to improving education outcomes for our students. So we think that there is an opportunity to leverage VR where the adoption, similar to the smartphone, is largely going to be driven by other markets, so that we can develop a centralized and comprehensive intervention into the STEM pedagogy. And partially this is because VR is such a natural fit for STEM. So what you're seeing here are some cartoon drawings of someone holding a quantum mechanical electron orbital. And this is a really highly abstract concept that's a probabilistic description of where electrons sit. But in VR, I can hold it in my hands. I can look all around it, inside it, and through it, and understand what it means to be probabilistic versus deterministic. And the way I interact with an environment with a virtual environment is the same way I interact with the environment around me. So it's really intuitive. So when you're picking things up and rotating them, looking inside of them, manipulating equations, it's identical to how you interact with the world around you. So VR is really exciting. I think from this perspective, this is what I was talking about when I had my aha moment of making these abstract, intangible concepts tangible and fungible, holdable. You can hold them in your hands, is one of the things that I think is immediately apparent about what VR can do. But I think maybe moving beyond that, I think when we look at virtual reality, of course, we can do things we couldn't do before. But what's more exciting is to scale things to me. So we can use that advanced visualization. We can build simulations around that capability, but then we can use it to build active learning exercises, problem-based inquiry, integrated assessment and feedback cycles, structured pedagogies on top of them. And what this lets us do is build that once validate its effectiveness, and then scale it anywhere there is a headset in the world. So just to maybe make a little clearer what I'm talking about, I'm going to paste this into chat in case anyone is having a frame rate issues or anything like that, so they can, oh wait, maybe I can't paste in chat. There we go. So there's the link if you want to watch it there. I'm also going to stream it here, but I know sometimes Zoom has some frame rate issues. So this is just a short video of actually one of our developers. What you're seeing is him interspersed on top of what he's seeing in virtual reality. His view is down here in the corner. And this is a lesson on trends you can figure out from the periodic table. So what you're seeing is here, he's working through a question about what the trend in atomic size is. So we're building in these aspects of assessment where students are doing engaging activities instead of answering things like multiple choice questions. But again, I think what the power you're seeing here are all of these intangible things, like for this case, bonding. The students are physically playing with the models and looking at how bonding occurs while having an entire environment around them. So it's not just the simulation, but there's narration, there's guidance and instruction. And I think kind of everything that we're showing here is mapping back on to the existing curriculum. Again, this is the case of as a physical chemist, this is the one I really like because it's about quantum mechanics. But we can do things like this, which is very much an analog of an pencil and paper exercise you do. We can also do things like this, where you're looking at the table that you would see in your textbook, and you're pulling out the 3D representations of those things and getting to actually hold them in your hands. I'm going to stop that there, although feel free to peruse that at your leisure. Are you guys seeing the share of the presentation again? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure things swapped right. So again, I'm a physical scientist. I'm driven by hypotheses and answering those hypotheses. And so the first question we asked was, this is great, but how effective is it? And so the way we evaluated that question was we built one initial lesson that was on atomic orbital theories, where we started, because this was an acknowledged pain point to all of my peers, that this was the one week that students struggle with the most. And we went to Stanford, Cal State Chico, and Loyola Marymount University, and administered this initial lesson to about 500 students across those three schools. And we were just looking at, for that particular topic, did we improve student learning outcomes by integrating the VR course or the VR tool into their existing pedagogy? And then we subsequently went and developed 5 additional courses. So they're meant to be taken one every other week in a 10-week quarter schedule. And looked at how those courses effectively improve students' understanding of chemistry more generally using existing assessment tools. And we also looked week over week how it was improving students' outcomes in the specific topic areas. And the point at which we introduced the VR intervention was normally, if we think about the cycle of a student, you assign some reading as preparation for lecture. Student comes to lecture, use a problem set to reinforce the concepts in lecture, and then you assess the students at some point, generally after a few cycles of the stuff on the left. Where we chose to integrate the VR activity was after students had done the reading, after they had done the preparatory lecture. In one of the study designs, we then gave students an initial assessment tool, had them use VR, and gave them a secondary assessment tool to look at their learning outcome improvement. And in another study design, we broke into A/B testing where some students had the VR tool and some students did not. And generally, I guess a couple more specifics here are how they actually integrated this into their class. So at Cal State Chico, this was an assigned out of class activity. Students used the library, had a setup. This is actually a picture taken of students at Chico. They were running them in groups of 25 at a time for 1 hour to use the VR class. This is at Stanford, where they actually integrated the VR tool into the lab as a replacement for about 45 minutes of what was happening in the lab activity. And at Loyola Marymount, this was just made available on a purely volunteer basis for students to access or not. This is where we did the A/B control split, where we tracked not only who chose to take advantage of the VR tool, but also how that impacted their outcomes in the course. So generally what we found, I'm going to show one subset of the outcomes of the studies, but I will say the magnitude of the learning outcomes are consistent regardless of the study format or the assessment that we chose to use, which is when we looked across the pre-post assessment for students after utilizing VR, we see about an increase in the learning outcomes of about a standard deviation or a letter grade. And when we look at how students felt about the utility of integrating VR, it improved after they used it and saw what they can actually get out of it. So this, I think, was the big exciting thing for us. This was what we saw initially with our first, I would say, kind of tech demo of what this could look like. And then this held consistently as we continued to build up the product. What's actually a little surprising to me is as the lesson got more sophisticated in terms of how it looked and what the user interface, how that was designed, et cetera, we didn't see any changes in these types of outcomes, which I'll dig into why that's interesting in a few moments. So if we look at a few other things, we studied a few demographic factors. The age dependence, so because we ran the study over about 9 months, we were able to use some of Stanford's the summer sessions at the institutions at Loyola and Stanford to get very early age students and much later students. So when we looked at students across from still in high school all the way out to kind of post-college, retaking a chemistry course as preparation for an advanced secondary degree, we really don't see any age dependence upon the magnitude of learning outcome improvement, which is the change from the dark blue to the light blue. We also don't see any gender dependence at all, which is very exciting. Everyone seems to have opinion on which gender they think this will help more. And so I'm very glad that we have this graph to show that it doesn't matter. And then I think one of the more exciting things, and I'll get to this a little bit more in a second, is we actually see, although we have an average improvement of a 1 standard deviation across the board, the students that you most need to impact if you want to improve retention are the C, D, and F students. Those are the students who are at the highest risk of leaving a STEM field. And for those students, when we classify the improvement on the pre-post testing scheme by the initial performance on the pre-test, we see a 300% improvement for the DNF students. And similarly, when we ask the students to self-assess their ability to perform STEM tasks, the students who think they are incapable of doing STEM show the largest improvement. So we're hitting the right target for who we want to affect. So just a summary, what we see kind of across the board is that we improve the students' learning outcomes by about a letter grade. When we do the experimental and control split, we're able to see that the students in the VR group, we drop the failure rate down to 0 relative to the mean of the entire population. And probably most exciting from a retention standpoint is the people who are performing would be failing the course are improving by almost 300% in terms of their learning outcomes. And yeah, more I would say soft stats. When kind of more on the qualitative side of the questionnaires that we give to students, 100% of them respond that they would like to see VR as part of their instruction, and 92% of them said they would have used it outside of class were it available to them. So what are we doing with this, right? And I think this is, well, I apparently had a transition animation, is building a framework around how to integrate VR. So the first piece of this is we're building a library of content that targets general education STEM courses, physics, biology, chemistry, and mathematics that you would take in a first or second year of university or at a community college, which also consequently covers what you would learn in those topics in high school as well. And then using those core digital simulations, we can wrap a layer of content creation tools around them so that instructors are in control of how to design that content. And this lets us scale the content beyond what we need to develop internally at SAMA, but also puts these tools in the hands of the best instructors and effectively gives them a crash course in good pedagogy design. So how you structure your learning objectives, where assessment needs to be in that feedback cycle, et cetera. And all of that has a data layer underneath it that is essentially tracking what the students are doing in the lesson, polling at kind of like a 20 hertz frequency, and trying to correlate that to their outcomes so that we can continue to improve the framework that we build the lessons on. And I think this is really, really critical because, again, one of the amazing things about VR is we have the ability to do data-driven improvement to what we're doing in VR. And so while the student is taking the lesson, we're tracking their interactions, we're looking at the correlation between the lesson design and the student outcomes, and then also binning types of students with what their outcomes are so that we can personalize the experience to the students, but also iterate on the scaffold in a data-driven way and then reiterate the lesson. And not to make this point, I think I want to make this point kind of really clearly. This is the equivalent of if I had some ability while I'm giving a lecture or teaching a course to be looking at what the students are thinking and how much uptake they have in real time. I've only got a couple more slides here. So I think if people like myself are wondering what is so impactful about the use of VR, I think things that we can say with relative certainty are part of the improvement in the student learning outcomes can be explained by the fact that we're using interventions that we know work. So the lessons inherently have active learning. There's assessment and feedback cycles with targeted feedback based on the specifics of what the student did wrong during an assessment question. The lessons are built on a learning scaffold. Any one of these interventions, you can expect kind of an improvement in the student learning outcome of about a half a letter grade. The things we don't know are what are the effects of the parts that are unique to VR? So the fact that you're in a 3D immersive environment allows you to tap into spatial kinetic memory. And so one of the best kind of anecdotes for this I always give is there was a study that looked at student memory retention when they were using a physical textbook versus a PDF. And they saw that the student memory retention with the physical textbook was higher. And they the explanation for this was when you have a physical textbook, you're turning the pages, your memory is associated with where the information was on a specific page, etc. And so for VR, we just don't understand the effect of spatial memory and what the magnitude of that is. We don't understand how the collection of interventions all at once helps different types of students differently, or how you parse what can be attributed to each of these interventions at present. we don't understand the relationship between the flow state and the learning outcomes. And so ultimately, we don't understand the magnitude of learning outcome improvement that's unique to VR versus the ability to scale these types of known interventions. And I want to highlight, I'm almost done. I think I have 2 slides left, and we can chat. That I think, like Bruce said, VR is not a silver bullet. There are ways to do VR wrong. And what I'm showing here are 2 of our VR lessons where we did a really short 4-question assessment for each of these lessons, pre and post, for students at Chico. And what we saw was, for one of the lessons, which was on hybridization bonding theory, we do see the types of improvements we expect. But for one of the lessons, we see that the student outcomes decreased with the integration of this lesson. And so this tells us, in this particular case, there's actually, I think, an issue with the assessment tool that we used. 2 of the questions are significantly harder in the post example, but there is also, I think, telling us that the way that this lesson was structured and how we layered the information hierarchy did not lead to students understanding the core learning objectives of the lesson. And so I think this is why it's incredibly important to integrate a data backend into these types of digital interventions. On the positive side, the last question that we asked students was just a free form: what other courses that you have taken or are taking currently would you like to see VR in? And again, we primarily were targeting STEM students who are taking chemistry, so I guess it's not surprising that there's a lot of STEM courses here. But what's intriguing to me is that we see kind of broad desire, and the students see utility across a huge number of courses outside of that core STEM field. And so with that, I will just end with acknowledging the team who did all this work. Myself, Barb DeHart, who's my co-founder, Justin Busan was our lead developer and really architect of the software. And DeLorean Lathers was the second developer we brought on, and a 3D artist. And I am happy to take questions.